In this video, you will learn about the Pre-Socratics. Many of you have probably heard of Socrates, who is considered the first philosopher, meaning Western philosopher. So much so that thinkers before him were called the Pre-Socratics. Before introducing Socrates, let's first learn about the Pre-Socratics. Before philosophy, Greek religious mythology was used to explain natural phenomena. Gods brought about natural disasters, told humans what to do, and determined the afterlife. Examples of important books in Greek mythology are Homer's Odyssey and Hesiod's Theogony. The pre-Socratic philosophers started to think differently. They started asking questions about the ultimate nature of reality and the ultimate nature of the material world. And they started giving more naturalistic answers to these questions. Examples of questions asked by the pre-Socratics are questions about the one and the many. How can one thing be the source of many things, for instance? Questions about change and constancy. How can things remain constant as they change over time? And questions about things like relativism. Are certain principles universal, or are certain things just true for a certain person or culture? The pre-Socratics, though, were mostly interested in the ultimate nature of the material world, and they were interested in giving naturalistic explanations. So in some sense, they were the first scientists. Thales was the first pre-Socratic. He was known as Thales of Miletus, and was born between 626 and 623 BC. For Thales, everything was ultimately made of water, and all other elements consisted of water modified in some way. Thales was famous for predicting an eclipse of the sun. In fact, predicting eclipses was a way to gain credibility in ancient Greece. And a story that was told about Thales is that he was often criticized for being poor. People would say, well, if you're so intelligent, Thales, how come you do not have any money? As a response to this, Thales one year predicted a good crop of olives and decided to rent out all the available olive presses in the area. When the good crop came, he rented these presses with a huge profit, making a lot of money. The story goes that he then commented that he could make money as well as anybody else, but he was just not interested in that. This set the stage for philosophers claiming not to be interested in money and that doing something for money is somehow demeaning to the philosopher. Socrates, as we will see further in the next video, also followed this principle. Another interesting pre-Socratic is Heraclitus. He was born in 540 BC. For him, the ultimate element was fire, not water. Heraclitus thought that the essence of the world is better represented by fire because, according to him, everything changes constantly. He was known for saying, "You can't step in the same river twice." As a person, Heraclitus was considered very erratic and eccentric. There is an anecdote that he died when he was sick and refused to go to a doctor. He didn't like doctors. And instead, he buried himself in manure, which did not work, or so the story goes. And so he died that way. These anecdotes about the pre-Socratics were most likely made up. It's probably not true. But they were created around their time, and so it indicates something about how they were seen by others, although the veracity of the stories can clearly be disputed. One of the most famous pre-Socratics is Pythagoras. Pythagoras had a slightly more sophisticated worldview. Instead of saying that some element was the basis of everything, water, fire, earth, or air, Pythagoras instead speculated that what was underneath all reality were mathematical relations and geometrical patterns. So he thought mathematics was underneath all of reality. Pythagoras founded a school called the Pythagorean school. This school was a remarkable institution, and sometimes it is described as a mathematician's cult. Surprisingly, the Pythagorean school also had women students, which was not very common. And it is rumored that Plato's mother, Plato was Socrates' student, and he wrote all the dialogues where Socrates appears. It is rumored that Plato's mother went to the Pythagorean school, which is pretty cool. For the Pythagoreans, everything was ultimately mathematical. Everything could be predicted and measured in rhythmic patterns. Pythagoras is better known for the Pythagorean theorem, which I'm sure you studied in high school. The Pythagorean theorem says that in a right-angled triangle, the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the square of the other sides. So you probably heard about this before. One anecdote about the Pythagorean school is that students were members of the school, because in that time they weren't really students, they were members. They were not supposed to talk about the existence of irrational numbers. The story goes that one student did talk about them outside of the school, following which, when this happened, the other members took him out on a boat and drowned him. This is probably also not true, but it's a funny story. Pythagoreans had a series of rules in their school that are puzzling to many, definitely puzzling to me. Here's some of the examples of rules of the Pythagorean school. First one was to abstain from beans, which is very strange since the Pythagoreans were said to be vegetarians, but they couldn't eat beans. Other rules are not to pick up what has fallen, not to stare at the fire with an iron, not to eat from a whole loaf, not to pluck a garland, not to walk on highways. This one seems like good advice. Not to let swallows share one's roof. There were several others. And then one more. When you rise from the bedcloths, roll them together and smooth out the impress of the body. I guess that was the early version of make your bed, I guess. Anyway, so these rules are quite puzzling, but they were supposed to be rules of the Pythagorean school. In my opinion, they are probably a code for something else. All right. A curious story about Pythagoras is that it is said he died when he was being chased by someone who intended to kill him. He came to a field of beans, which he refused to cross, therefore being caught and killed on the spot. So he died because he wouldn't cross a field of beans. Again, it's just an anecdote. There's stories about it, a lot of the Pre-Socratics, so the way they died. All right. In Greece, there were also women philosophers. Unfortunately, their writings were mostly lost. One example is Diotima, who is said in Plato's Symposium. It is said that she was Socrates' teacher, and Socrates talks about Diotima's theory of love that he says he learned from her. So women definitely had some role in philosophy, although it was not super common. All right. Another important element in the philosophical scene in Greece that also set the stage for Socrates were the Sophists. The Sophists taught the art of rhetoric, and they were traveling freelance teachers. They taught the art of argument for a fee, so they did take money for their services. They typically did not believe in the myths, and they liked to teach how to argue for every side of the question. Because of this, they were despised by Socrates, who said they did not care for the truth. And the term sophist was sometimes used as an insult and represented someone who reasons subtly but deceiving. The intention would be to deceive who they're reasoning with. This might not be super fair to portray all the sophists this way, but it was definitely the way they were portrayed. In fact, there's a play when we talk about Socrates, Aristophanes' The Clouds, where Socrates appears as a character, and he is called a sophist in that play, which he was obviously horrified about that. All right. There are many, many, many more Pre-Socratics that I didn't go into in this video. You can look them up. They're super interesting. We only have like fragments of what they wrote, but from what others at the time wrote about them, including Plato, we can get a clear and interesting view on what their position was. I would definitely encourage you to do some independent research on the Pre-Socratics, as they have many interesting ideas and positions. For instance, you have atomists that said that everything was ultimately made of atoms already in that time, so it's pretty interesting. For now, these will be sufficient to set the stage for our main character, Socrates, and I will talk more about him in the next video. Thanks for listening.